5 seconds, that is all the warning a German artillery target ever received if the Americans had set up the mission correctly. 5 seconds between the first shell and the last, across a target area the size of a city block, with rounds fired from positions miles apart landing simultaneously, the first shell and the final shell arriving as a single event. No ranging shot, no adjustment, no bracket, just silence and then everything destroyed at once. Any trained Wehrmacht officer in 1944 would have recognized the problem immediately. Artillery, by every doctrine on the European continent, announced itself. A single ranging round would fall short, an observer would call corrections, the battery would adjust. There was always an interval, a breathing room between the ranging and the full volley. That interval was not a weakness in artillery doctrine. It was a biological necessity baked into the physics of the thing. No gun in 1944 could compute, without adjustment, the exact ballistic arc needed to drop a shell on a specific target from miles away on the first shot, accounting for barrel wear, wind, propellant temperature, and the curvature of the Earth. Except that in the summer of 1944 something in Normandy was doing exactly that, routinely, repeatedly, against German positions that had been occupied for minutes rather than hours. The German officers who survived wrote about it afterward in language that had no equivalent in their training. The word that appeared most often in after-action reports, in post-war manuscripts, in the prisoner interrogation records that the U.S. Army's historical division compiled between 1945 and 1952, was unerklärlich, inexplicable. They were reading the right data. They had the wrong dictionary. How does the most mathematically sophisticated artillery system ever deployed in ground warfare spend the opening months of its operational life being diagnosed by some of the most experienced military professionals in the world as amateur fumbling? And what does the answer tell us about what happens when one side of a war changes the definition of what artillery is for, without announcing the change? Part 1. The Doctrine of the Careful Man. The German army did not arrive at the doctrinal assumptions it carried into Normandy by accident. It arrived there through 4 years of combat on 3 continents, against enemies ranging from professional British regulars to Soviet armies of a scale no German planner had fully anticipated. And through all of it, one operational reality had never changed. There was never enough shells, never enough fuel to move the shells to where the guns were. Never enough guns in the right place at the right time, because the right place was always changing, and the transportation network to service it was always being bombed, flooded, or stretched beyond design capacity. The fundamental experience of German logistics throughout the war, from the mud of the Soviet steppe to the sand of the Western Desert, was rationing, allocation. The arithmetic of scarcity applied to every level of the military hierarchy, from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht down to the battery commander deciding which of his remaining 40 rounds to expend on a target that might or might not be worth it. This scarcity produced a doctrine of precision. The Artilleriedienstvorschrift, the German army's governing artillery manual, codified what combat experience had confirmed. Every round must justify itself. Reconnaissance before firing. A registration on known reference points. A carefully observed ranging shot, then adjustment, then engagement, the full ritual of methodical gunnery that a trained observer could execute with a stopwatch and a set of pre-computed firing tables. Fire without registration was considered by German doctrine a form of professional failure. It announced your position, consumed your irreplaceable ammunition, and statistically produced results inferior to those achievable through patient, methodical engagement. German battery commanders were evaluated in part on their ammunition expenditure. A commander who fired too many rounds on a target that could have been neutralized with fewer was not praised for aggressiveness. He was questioned. The man who commanded the German 84th Corps in Normandy before his death on June 12, 1944, was General Erich Marx, a one-legged veteran of the Eastern Front, a professional soldier of genuine distinction who had helped plan Operation Barbarossa and who understood artillery in its classical European form as well as any officer alive. Marx had watched German guns perform with lethal precision against Soviet positions at Kursk and against British armor in North Africa. He had also watched American artillery in action in the intelligence reports that circulated through German command in the months following the North Africa campaign and the fighting in Sicily and Italy. Those reports told a consistent story. American artillery was abundant, sometimes lavishly so but undisciplined. American gunners fired before they had properly registered. They expended enormous quantities of ammunition on targets that a professional observer would have neutralized with a fraction of the rounds. The American soldier, German analysis had concluded by early 1944, was a citizen pressed into uniform who fought with the habits of a factory worker, producing volume rather than precision, substituting mass for method. A German Corps evaluation circulating in the 84th Corps staff in the weeks before D-Day characterized American field artillery as technically adequate but doctrinally primitive. The phrase is almost certainly Marx's. He did not live long enough to understand that he had written the most accidentally accurate military assessment of the entire Western campaign. The German defensive position in Normandy in June and July 1944 was built on this assessment. The hedgerow country, the bocage, was genuine defensive terrain. Dense agricultural field boundaries, sunken roads, limited visibility, and ground that favored the defender who knew it over the attacker who did not. German units in the bocage had established layered positions, correctly cited by every doctrinal standard, with registered defensive fire plans that could bring predetermined concentrations onto known approach routes within minutes of observation. The men in those positions were veterans or near veterans. The system they occupied was sound. On the morning of July 19, 1944, near the village of Saint-Jean-de-Day, a German forward observer attached to the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division reported something that his after-action account described as a peculiarity rather than a threat. American artillery appeared to be firing from multiple directions simultaneously on a single target, with no preceding registration and no ranging shots. The target was a road junction. The concentration lasted approximately 40 seconds. When German infantry attempted to move through the junction 30 minutes later, it was impassable. The observer filed it as exceptional American luck. His battalion commander agreed. Their framework gave them no alternative. Part 2: The machine that looked like madness. The system the Americans were using had a name, a governing doctrine, and a set of engineering solutions that had been in active development since 1941. The name was Time on Target. The governing document was Field Manual 620, the U.S. Army's manual for field artillery tactics and technique, and its operational supplements. The engineering solutions were a network of radio-equipped fire direction centers that, by the summer of 1944, had transformed American artillery from a collection of individual firing units into something that functioned, when properly employed, as a single coordinated weapon of continental scale. Here is the mechanism, stated plainly. A forward observer locates a target and transmits its coordinates to a fire direction center, an FDC, a specialized computing unit attached to each artillery battalion. The FDC computes the firing data for every battery under its control. For a time-on-target mission, the FDC calculates not only the azimuth and elevation for each gun, but the exact moment each battery must fire, accounting for the different distances each shell will travel, so that all rounds arrive at the target simultaneously. A battery 3 miles from the target fires after a battery 7 miles away. The shells are in the air at different times. They land together. From the German side, this process was invisible. What a German soldier or observer experienced was this: no ranging shot, no bracket, no methodical adjustment, and then, without warning, simultaneous detonations across the entire target area from multiple apparent directions. The first round was the last round of the first salvo. There was no interval to exploit. There was no pause in which to move, to treat casualties, to disperse and reconsolidate. The breathing room that German infantry doctrine counted on as an operational reality had been engineered out of existence. What it looked like from the German side was chaos. Random fire from multiple directions, no fire discipline, no professional method, no evidence of the meticulous target acquisition that distinguished trained gunners from armed mobs. German observers watching American artillery often filed their reports under the contemptuous category Schlamperei, sloppiness, an embarrassment by professional standards, the kind of fire a well-trained unit learns to absorb and continue fighting through. They were watching a precisely mathematical system that required the coordination of multiple separate commands, the near-simultaneous firing of dozens of guns from separated positions, and the solution of a ballistic timing problem that would have been considered computationally impossible under pre-war artillery doctrine. They looked at it and saw incompetence because their doctrine offered no other category. First Lieutenant Carroll B. Anderson, 258th Field Artillery Battalion, 8th Infantry Division, from Lansing, Michigan, wrote in a letter to his family in August 1944. We fire so much that the crews work in shifts just to keep from burning out. I've put more rounds downrange in 6 weeks here than in 6 months of training back in the States. The Germans must think we've lost our minds. Maybe we have, but it keeps working, and nobody at battalion has told us to slow down, so we don't. Anderson was describing, without knowing its technical name, the operational outcome of a doctrine built not on precision in the German sense, but on a different kind of precision entirely. The precision of timing, coordination, and industrial supply at a scale that made continuous high-volume fire not just possible but sustainable. The Americans were not firing at random. They were firing on a mathematical schedule that the Germans lacked the category to recognize as a schedule. The industrial foundation that made this possible was American in every sense. In the 12 months between July 1943 and July 1944, American factories produced ammunition for the Army's European theater at rates that had no peacetime equivalent. Army Service Forces records for mid-1944 show that ammunition dumps in the Normandy lodgement area held sufficient stocks to sustain weeks of high-intensity fire. The Red Ball Express, the emergency truck convoy system that began operating on August 25, 1944, moved an average of 12,500 tons of supplies per day along its circuit of French roads. Artillery ammunition was the single largest category in that tonnage. An American battery commander in Normandy in the summer of 1944 made one calculation: where is the target? He did not calculate whether the mission was worth the shells. He did not consult an allocation schedule. The shells were there. The mission was worth it by definition, because the Americans had built a system in which ammunition was not a limiting factor in the tactical decision. By late July, the German command structure was registering the effects in language that shifted in tone with an unmistakable direction. Reports from units in the St. Lo sector no longer described American artillery as wasteful. They described it as oppressive. A report from the 352nd Infantry Division, dated July 22, noted that movement of any vehicle in daylight on any road within 4 kilometers of the front lines produced an artillery response within 3 to 5 minutes. 3 to 5 minutes. In the doctrinal world of German artillery planning, the minimum response time for a properly staffed fire mission from a registered battery was 6 to 8 minutes under ideal conditions. The Americans were responding to targets of opportunity in half the doctrinal minimum, from multiple batteries, without prior registration. General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer Division, Rommel's former chief of staff, a man who had watched German artillery perform at its absolute professional peak in North Africa, submitted a report in the third week of July that asked, in language that German officers rarely allowed themselves, a question he could not answer: where were the intervals between fire missions? Every trained unit expects intervals. Intervals to move, to regroup, to treat casualties. The Americans, Bayerlein reported, did not appear to be leaving any. There was an answer to his question. He did not yet have the vocabulary to reach it. Part 3: The River of Steel. The Red Ball Express is perhaps the most famous logistical operation in American military history, and it is famous for the right reasons. Between August 25 and November 16, 1944, approximately 5,958 trucks operated in rotation along a one-way circuit of French roads, eastward on one route, westward on another, continuous day and night without pause. Official army records credit the operation with delivering more than 412,000 tons of supplies in its 82-day operational life. The drivers, a majority of them black soldiers from segregated service units, men whose contribution to the Allied victory the Army's official histories initially undersold, drove shifts of 16 and 18 hours without sleep. The trucks ran until the engines seized, then they brought different trucks. Read that figure again: 412,000 tons in 82 days. In the same period, the German 7th Army's supply situation was governed by a different arithmetic. The Luftwaffe could no longer guarantee aerial resupply to forward airfields. Allied air superiority over France had been established in April and had never been seriously contested since. The road and rail network in northern France had been systematically bombed by the 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command since the spring of 1944, reducing German logistical throughput in the theater by an estimated 75% from its pre-invasion capacity. Captured German supply rosters, analyzed by Army intelligence units in the weeks following the Normandy breakout, showed that artillery units in the 7th Army were operating on allotments as low as 8 rounds per gun per day during the worst phases of the summer fighting. Not a doctrinal choice, an arithmetic reality. The comparison requires no rhetorical assistance. A German artillery battery operating on 8 rounds per gun per day had 240 rounds available for an entire week of combat. An American battery in the same period had ready access to ammunition at a rate bounded not by supply, but by the physical endurance of the gun crews. The German battery commander who managed his 240 rounds with perfect tactical efficiency, who extracted every casualty-producing effect from every shell through meticulous targeting and patient observation, was doing his job flawlessly. His American counterpart was deciding which of several available fire missions to prioritize for the next 10 minutes. These were not two versions of the same profession. They were two different professions operating in the same physical space. A captured German supply sergeant, his account preserved in the U.S. Army Historical Division's post-war interview series, described crossing a road junction in Normandy that American artillery had struck 18 hours earlier. What he remembered 40 years later when the interview was recorded was not the destruction. He had seen destruction before. What he remembered was the density of the cratering. He had worked in logistics his entire military career. He had developed an intuitive sense of what a given ammunition expenditure produced in terms of ground effect. What he saw at that road junction required, by his professional estimate, more artillery ammunition than his entire division had fired in the previous month. He used the word unfassbar, ungraspable. The Germans had built a doctrine of the possible, a system that extracted maximum effect from constrained resources through precision, methodology, and professional discipline. It was genuinely impressive. It had won battles, but embedded within it was an assumption so foundational that no German field manual ever felt the need to state it explicitly, that the enemy, whoever he was, would eventually face the same constraints. That war was a competition of efficiency precisely because no side had unlimited resources, that the side that allocated most wisely would ultimately prevail. The Americans were not competing in the efficiency category. They had changed the contest. The American system, from factory floor to fire direction center, had been built on a different premise. That abundance itself, deployed with speed and coordination, was a weapon, not the shells individually, the certainty of the shells. The knowledge in every American forward observer's mind that when he called a fire mission, the rounds would come, all of them, as many as the target required for as long as the target existed. The German battery commander who rationed brilliantly was outmaneuvered not by a better rationing system, but by an opponent who had made rationing irrelevant. If the history that actually happened, not the simplified version, is what you come here for, subscribe. That's what this channel is for. By the last week of July 1944, as American armor began breaking through the gap at Avranches, and the German defensive line in Normandy began to unravel, Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who had replaced Rundstedt as Commander-in-Chief West on July 2, sent a report to Hitler's headquarters. It was a professional communication from a senior commander attempting to explain a deteriorating situation to a superior who did not want to hear explanations. Von Kluge had choices about what to emphasize, what to blame, what to minimize. He chose, in a single sentence, to state something that historians have quoted for 80 years because it is the most precise description of professional disorientation ever written under fire. The enemy's artillery does not behave as artillery is supposed to behave. He did not explain what he meant. He did not have to. Every German officer who read it knew exactly what he was describing. A system that followed rules they did not have in their manuals. Part 4. When the map stopped working. Fritz Bayerlein survived Operation Cobra. His division did not. Panzer Lehr had entered Normandy in June 1944 as one of the most fully equipped armoured divisions in the Wehrmacht. 237 tanks and assault guns, nearly 14,000 men, with a lineage of combat experience that stretched back to the first campaigns in France. By the evening of July 25, 1944, following the American air and artillery preparation that opened the Cobra breakthrough, it was effectively destroyed as a fighting formation. Bayerlein's post-war account, written for the U.S. Army Historical Division in the late 1940s as part of the Foreign Military Studies series, is one of the most clinically precise descriptions of doctrinal collapse in the historical literature of the Second World War. He approached July 25 with the detachment of a man who has spent years attempting to understand something that still did not fully make sense to him. The American artillery preparation violated every principle I had learned about how artillery is employed, Bayerlein wrote. There was no ranging, there was no systematic adjustment, there were no intervals between concentrations, no pauses I could identify as the signature of battery rotation or ammunition resupply. My regimental commanders reported that their men could not move, could not dig, could not treat their wounded. Every road, every field, every position was under fire simultaneously. My men were not suppressed in the technical sense, they were paralyzed. Pause on that sentence. A Panzer Lehr regimental commander, commanding men drawn from some of the most experienced units in the German order of battle, reported to Bayerlein that his soldiers could not treat their wounded, not because American fire had specifically targeted medical positions, because there was no moment, no gap, no recognizable interval in the fire pattern during which movement of any kind was survivable. The ground itself had become the weapon. Bayerlein requested reinforcements on the evening of July 25. No reinforcements were available. Every unit that might have moved to support Panzer Lehr was itself under American artillery fire. This was not coincidence and it was not luck. The American fire plan for Operation Cobra, developed by 1st Army's Artillery Section under Brigadier General Charles Kibler, had specifically designed coordinated concentrations to interdict every road and approach route leading into the breakthrough sector simultaneously, not sequentially, simultaneously. The reinforcements that could have reached Bayerlein were stopped 15 kilometers away by artillery concentrations that Bayerlein could not have known existed, because American signal intelligence and aerial observation had identified the German reserve positions and pre-targeted them before the attack began, and the German communication network in the breakthrough sector had been destroyed in the first 90 minutes of the preparation. Panzer Lehr did not simply lose a battle on July 25. Its doctrinal framework for understanding what it was fighting broke down first, and the loss of combat power followed. General Hasso von Manteuffel commanded the 5th Panzer Army during the Ardennes offensive beginning December 16, 1944, a different season, a different theatre, and a very different operational situation. The Germans had achieved tactical surprise. American units in the Ardennes had been caught in positions they were holding for rest and refitting. By every doctrinal expectation, the American artillery response in the opening hours should have been confused, delayed, and piecemeal. It was none of those things. Von Manteuffel's post-war testimony to American Army historians describes the experience with the specificity of a professional who is still, years later, working through an anomaly. Within 4 hours of our initial penetration of the American front, artillery fire was falling on positions we had not yet reached, positions we intended to move forces toward. The Americans were not firing at where we were, they were firing at where we would be. He paused in the interview according to the interviewer's notes before adding, "I did not know at the time how they were doing this. I am not certain I fully understand it now." What von Manteuffel was experiencing was the operational consequence of the American fire direction system at its most sophisticated. Aerial observers in Piper L-4 liaison planes identifying the German axes of advance from the air, relaying coordinates to FDCs that prepositioned fires along the projected movement corridors, executing time-on-target missions on positions that German ground units had not yet occupied. The Americans were not clairvoyant. They were reading terrain, reading unit movement patterns, and using a communication and computation system fast enough to translate the reading into fires before the situation it described had arrived. A like on this video costs nothing. For the soldiers who produced what these German commanders are describing, it is the least we can do. The technological element that deepened the confusion past, the point of German recovery, was introduced into the European theatre in the autumn of 1944. The VT fuse, variable time, was an American proximity fuse that caused artillery shells to detonate at a preset height above the ground rather than on impact. The fragmentation cone it produced made the standard German infantry response to incoming artillery, digging in, functionally useless. A soldier in a correctly constructed field position, following the doctrinal standard German infantry training had established over 4 years of war, was now vulnerable to the same artillery that his position was supposed to defeat. The first reports from German infantry units in December 1944 describing casualties in positions that should have been safe reached higher headquarters without explanation, because no German officer in the field yet understood what had changed. Men were dying in foxholes. Foxholes were supposed to protect them. The doctrine said so. The German Army Group B situation reports from the Ardennes sector by January 1945 had undergone a transformation that any careful reader would have found alarming. They no longer described American artillery in tactical terms as a fire system to be countered, outmaneuvered, or endured. They described it in terms of terrain, not American artillery is active here. This road is impassable. The distinction is not subtle. An army that describes its enemy as a feature of the landscape has stopped believing the landscape can be changed. Part 5, The Wrong Dictionary. The last recorded position of Panzer Lehr as an organized combat formation in Normandy was a stretch of road between Mesnil-Durand and Saint-Gilles, southwest of Saint-Lô, on the evening of July 25, 1944. American aerial photographs taken the following morning showed what remained. Vehicles stopped in the positions they had occupied when the American fires came, some on the road surface, some pulled onto the shoulders, some in mid-turn that had not been completed. The fields surrounding the road were cratered at a density that American after-action reports described with a word not typically used in military documentation: total, not heavy damage, not significant destruction. Total, what the photographs did not show, what soldiers who walked through the area in the following days remembered as the detail that stayed with them, was the absence of gaps. No section of road that had been spared. No field that the fire had missed. No position, correctly sighted and adequately prepared, that had provided the protection doctrine said it should. The destruction was continuous in a way that felt, to men trained to expect irregular artillery damage, somehow wrong, like a landscape that had not been fought over but processed. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt had been relieved of command on July 2, before the final collapse of the Normandy front. He did not see the outcome he had helped create with his pre-campaign assessment of American artillery capability. He saw it differently from an Allied interrogation room in 1945, responding to questions about what had surprised him most about the American military. The pause before he answered is noted in the interrogation record. Then, the artillery. I had studied the reports from North Africa. I had read the analyses from Italy. I believed I understood what the Americans were doing with their artillery. I was wrong. What they did in France was not what I had been prepared to encounter. The coordination of their fires, the volume and continuity of it, this was not what any of my professional experience had led me to anticipate. And I will tell you plainly, I did not know how to prepare for it. I do not know even now what preparation would have looked like. The man who had presided over an assessment dismissing American artillery as the work of industrialists rather than soldiers sat in Allied custody and said, with a professional's careful choice of words, that he had been wrong about the nature of the thing he was fighting. Here is the forensic verdict. The Germans were not wrong about what they observed. They saw artillery that fired without meticulous registration, that expended rounds at rates that made no sense if the standard was shells per confirmed casualty, that appeared to lack the methodical professionalism that European artillery doctrine treated as the baseline of competence. Every observation was accurate. Every conclusion was wrong. The German doctrinal framework, built through 4 years of genuine professional success, gave them no category for an artillery system that was not trying to be efficient in the German sense. The Americans were not measuring success by the same unit of measurement. The Germans measured artillery effectiveness by what it killed. The Americans were measuring it by what it prevented: movement, concentration, reinforcement, the ability to function as an organized military force. These are not different tactics for achieving the same objective. They are different definitions of what the objective is. An army using one definition cannot evaluate an enemy pursuing the other. It can only observe results. It cannot explain and file them under the closest available category. The Germans filed the results under Schlamperei. The filing error cost them the war. The lesson does not belong to artillery. It belongs to every competition where one side is rationing and one side is flooding. The side with more resources does not automatically win. History is full of numerically superior armies defeated by the more disciplined force. What changes the outcome is when the side with abundance changes what it is trying to do with that abundance. The Germans were trying to kill efficiently. The Americans were trying to make it impossible for the German army to function as an organization. Killing efficiently is a subset of that goal. Making it impossible to function is the whole game. An efficiency expert measuring the wrong outcome will always misread the opponent pursuing the right one. On a hillside above the town of Margraten in the Netherlands American cemetery holds 8,301 grave white marble markers set in rows so precise they read, "From the air," as a kind of final fire mission computed to the last decimal. Among them are men from the field artillery battalions whose fire direction centers, forward observer teams, and ammunition trains built the system this video has examined. The 258th Field Artillery Battalion. The 62nd Armored Field Artillery Battalion. The 987th Field Artillery Battalion. Their names are on the markers. The records documenting what they did, the battalion fire mission logs, the FDC worksheets, the after-action reports describing time on target missions in the Bocage and the Ardennes, are held at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. They are declassified. They are available to anyone who asks. The evidence that the Germans found inexplicable is sitting in a filing cabinet in Maryland, in the handwriting of men who were in their 20s when they wrote it. If your father, grandfather, or great-grandfather served in the American Field Artillery, Armored Forces, or Supply Corps in the European theater, put their name and unit in the comments. The men who built this system deserve to be in the record.